Outpost Delta, an October night. A storm of gunfire ripped the darkness apart. In the muddy trenches, Captain Miller wrestled with the radio, shouting into the static. The growling interference signaled mismatched coordinates they were being overrun. Waves of attacks pressed in from the tree line. Their only support was artillery stationed 50 kilometers away, but the 105mm shells fell into the canopy, detonating weakly and uselessly. Miller's men screamed beneath the earthen wall. They were surrounded, pushed back, and the very guns meant to save them were firing into empty air. The night had become a steel wall, shielding the enemy from every trace of modern firepower. Vietnam, early 1960s, a battlefield defined by unique technical conditions. Those conditions broke the assumptions of classical warfare. The jungle was dense. Treetops fused into a continuous layer of cover. At night, visibility dropped to almost zero. In such an environment, systems and procedures designed for open terrain revealed their flaws. Sensing, identifying, and hitting a target became more critical and more difficult than ever before. In reconnaissance and targeting, the difficulties came from two key factors: unreliable data and environmental noise. Low-altitude radar picked up irregular reflections from the canopy signals scattered, creating blind zones across the target map. Optical reconnaissance at night was nearly useless. Weak light smothered by leaves and any use of spotlights or flares would expose one's own position. As a result, situational maps lacked the accurate coordinates needed for fire correction. When it came to weapons, the problem lay in how they interacted with the environment. When bombs fell into the jungle, many detonated above or within the treetops. The blast energy dissipated before reaching the ground, dramatically reducing surface-level damage. Theoretical penetration and explosive yield were absorbed and scattered by the forest canopy. Artillery, though precise in open terrain, relied on coordinates and observed impacts for correction. In the jungle, impact observation was impossible. Initial coordinate errors, sometimes hundreds of meters, left shells falling into useless ground. The effect on combat procedures was systemic. Traditional tactics followed the cycle: detect, aim, adjust, fire again. That cycle demanded real-time feedback. Once feedback vanished, accuracy collapsed. The targeting standards of that era, aerial reconnaissance photos, ground observers' high-altitude radar, were never designed for an environment of fragmented signals and continuous canopy cover. The result: night air support and artillery in the jungle often proved ineffective, wasteful, and dangerously prone to civilian casualties from misidentification. Time and logistics made matters worse. Forward command systems required fast, precise coordinates. Any delay or error turned support missions into dead weight. Even massive increases in fire volume still depended on the ability to bring shells close enough to target, a capability limited by terrain and airspace control. From these constraints, reports and training manuals of the era drew a common conclusion in jungle nights. Air power and artillery lost their precision. The advantage belonged to those who could hide. That was the classical logic. But it's worth noting that conclusion reflected the limits of sensors and procedures at the time, not an immutable law of physics. The tactical question was, in fact, quite specific: how to deliver precise, continuous, and verifiable fire onto a pinpoint target on the ground, under jungle canopy at night, when traditional data sources had failed. It was the same question rephrased: how do you hit what you cannot see? And the real question was, who would be mad enough to try a new way of firing in the very first darkness? From the helplessness before the jungle night, a mindset emerged that would change the rules of the game. When existing systems failed to deliver targeting data by traditional means, the solution was to put fire exactly on the coordinates without needing direct visual observation. The idea of side firing was born from that problem, a shift in thinking with direct consequences for every combat mission. Yet this was not a welcome solution. To many, mounting guns on the flank of a C-47 was suicide and ran counter to the instincts of transport flying. Pilots had to fight their own reflexes, banking the aircraft at angles others considered reckless, simply to keep the stream of fire converged. The idea, brilliant though it was, had to overcome skepticism and institutional inertia before it could defeat the enemy. In a makeshift briefing room at Biên Hòa, Captain Mark Ellis, a C-47 resupply pilot with more than 2,000 hours of airdrop time, stood leaning on the map as the side-firing proposal was presented for the first time. A lieutenant colonel frowned. You want to orbit over enemy positions, bank the aircraft, and keep yourself inside anti-aircraft range. That's suicide, Ellis, Ellis replied tersely. Delta called for 105s all night and every target missed. If we don't keep fires on top of them next time, nobody will be left to call. He signed up for the test crew, not because he loved risk, but because he had seen with his own eyes how impotent the old logic could be when flying resupply to besieged outposts and being able to do nothing. If you cannot identify the target from the nose of the aircraft, why not shoot sideways? The gunship concept was a technical audacity. Side-mounted weapon configuration. Miniguns, Gatling guns, were mounted to fire out the side, not the nose or belly of the aircraft. For hardened targets, larger guns were also mounted on this axis. Orbit. When given the grid coordinates from the ground, the aircraft would lock onto the target and begin continuous orbiting. That flight path transformed the trajectories into a circle on the ground, allowing a sustained area of fire to be maintained over the target. Gunships changed how survivable missions in the jungle were conducted. Fire-based defense. When a fire base was besieged, there was no need to wait for adjusted artillery fire from afar. The gunship would stay on station, lock the coordinates, and deliver unrelenting fire until the ground was secure. Interdiction gunships patrolled the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When sensors detected points of concentration among convoy elements, they would go into orbit and use a continuous rain of fire to incapacitate vehicle movement. CSR, Special Ops Support. In pilot rescue, CSR or Special Ops Support in confined areas, a gunship created a fire denial zone with uncompromising fire, buying the golden time for recovery teams to operate. The risks remained prolonged. Orbiting increased exposure to low-altitude anti-aircraft fire. A slightest error in coordinates could cause friendly casualties. Therefore, deployment was always constrained by FAC-provided coordinates and strict ROE. The first test mounting the system on a C-47 to relieve a besieged outpost would be the ultimate proof for this breakthrough. On October 15, 1964, at Biên Hòa, a C-47 was chosen as the gunship testbed, wide, rugged, and stable enough to turn a daring idea on paper into real firepower. On October 20, 1964, engineers at Biên Hòa went to work. Under floodlights, the fuselage was opened. 3 GE 7.62mm miniguns were installed along the left side, angled downward according to calculated firing solutions. The gun mounts were specially reinforced to withstand the enormous recoil when all 3 guns fired simultaneously. Complex radar equipment was removed. A single basic sight mounted on the floor was deemed sufficient. There was no ballistics computer, everything depended on the pilot's experience and the gunner's eye. On December 1, 1964, the modified C-47, nicknamed Spooky, was ready for combat trials. The first mission, defend a small fire base in the Mekong Delta under siege. Jungle terrain, darkness everywhere, and the enemy believed themselves invisible, a belief reinforced over many years. Reports from the ground, enemy forces closing in, numerous but lightly armed. For the troops on the ground, the situation felt desperate, as if abandoned in the night. 21:00. AC-47 took off from Biên Hòa. Captain Mark Ellis sat hard behind the controls eyes, never leaving the black horizon. The twin engines of the old C-47 roared as it climbed into the night sky. 21:15. The aircraft entered its orbit. Ellis held the controls tightly and banked the aircraft a precise 30 degrees, feeling the airframe strain under centrifugal force. He knew that a few degrees of error would send the burst past his own men. The order to fire was given. Before the order, silence in the cabin was taut as a string. The pilot felt the wing strain under centrifugal load. He knew that when the guns opened up, the aircraft would be thrown, and he had to hold it steady. This was the control of a contained explosion. The 3 miniguns roared together, not a single crack, but a steady stream of sound tearing the sky. The airframe shook under the recoil. Gunpowder smoke filled the cabin, tracer rounds tore past the cargo door in strobing flashes. The weapons system was operating at the edge of its physical limits. The enemy, confident in the dark, was caught completely off guard. In the trenches, the men on the ground looked up. They didn't hear isolated rounds so much as a high, keening scream from above, and then suddenly silence. The survivors fled in panic. The firebase was saved and not a single soldier was lost. AC-47 returned to base at 22 Zurlip intact. AC-47 returned to base at 22 Zurlitz completely unscathed. On the taxiway, Ellis shut down the engines and sat in the dark cockpit for a few seconds. He had just done what 10 days earlier had been called a suicide idea. Outside the firebase still stood. For him, that was enough to fly again. A FAC on the ground scribbled in his notebook, "We did not see the plane, we only heard the sky scream and then go quiet, and there were still men alive outside the trench." The report dated December 2nd noted the outcome. The enemy was utterly surprised that an aircraft could deliver sustained accurate fire in the dark. The troops described it. The whole sky seemed on fire. The ground commander, Captain Nguyen Van Hoa, wrote in the report, "Fire from the AC-47 stopped the assault and broke the enemy's morale. We heard screams of panic from the jungle. The power of Spooky produced palpable fear, a circling machine vomiting rounds like an endless storm of fire." On December 5th, the report was forwarded up the chain. After initial skepticism, the commanders at Biên Hòa proposed expanding the program. Performance far exceeded expectations, the miniguns ran reliably, and the basic sighting system proved sufficiently accurate. An 8-man crew, pilots, gunners, and engineers worked in concert, turning risk into an advantage. A Spooky pilot later recalled, "Holding 30° with your heart pounding like a hammer, but the aiming point stayed steady." On December 10th, the order was issued to expand AC-47 production. The trials at Biên Hòa initiated a prolonged technical evolution, from the simple C-47 platform to an integrated gunship system on the C-130 airframe. Each upgrade step aimed to address field limitations and expand the mission set. From AC-47 to AC-130. The AC-47 Spooky proved the concept, but revealed limits in speed, payload, and on-station time. The AC-119 C-119's increased weapon carriage and endurance, but its high-wing airframe made control during steep bank angles more complex. Ultimately, the AC-130 C-130 became the target platform, the fuselage was redesigned, and auxiliary fuel tanks added to extend time on target and carry heavy artillery. Ellis was among the first invited to inspect the new gunship, fit on a C-130 at Da Nang. He ran a hand along the 40mm and 105mm barrels and told the engineer beside him, "If this had been at Delta last year, we wouldn't have been calling 105s blind all night." The engineers noted the remark in the margin of the design, "Keep the aircraft on target as long as possible." Weapons summary: firepower is the heart of the gunship. Over time, weapons were upgraded to handle a wider range of targets. Minigun, 7.62mm AC-47, high rate of fire, effective against infantry, limited range and effect on hardened targets. Requires strict thermal management. Vulcan 20mm AC-119, extended range and penetration, effective against light fortifications and light vehicles. Bofors 40mm AC-130, produces a fragmentation burst effect, effective against medium-sized fortifications. Howitzer 105mm AC-130, large destructive power, defeats hardened targets. The main technical challenge is recoil, requiring recoil reduction systems and reinforced airframe structure. Technical details, RPM, ranges, firing, rest cycles are placed in the technical appendix if needed. Sensor improvements. From the basic optical sight on the AC-47 gunships were fitted with FLIR radar and laser rangefinders on the AC-130. FLIR allowed detection of body heat through night and across canopy. Radar supported long-range target detection. Laser provided range references accurate to a few meters. Each sensor had limits, for example latency and thermal imagery, and required training to compensate when engaging moving targets. Automation and deployment. Integrated systems and the fire control computer shifted the gunner's role from direct manual operation to system supervision. The system applied ballistic compensation for environmental conditions, wind altitude, humidity, and linked sensors to weapons to achieve high accuracy. As the technology advanced, gunship missions expanded to interdiction, CSR, and SED. Deployment scale increased, and the AC-130 gradually became a rapid reaction force on multiple battlefields. The pilot maintained a steady orbit. Every change in speed forced him to recalculate the balance between lift and centrifugal force. Every second was a life-or-death equation. Depending on the mission, the AC-130 operated at altitudes from a few hundred meters up to around 2,000 meters, with an orbital radius ranging from several hundred meters to nearly 1 kilometer, enough to keep the target within weapon range. Before firing, target coordinates were always confirmed by radio. The role of the FAC forward air controller was crucial. They provided the initial coordinates and, when needed, used flares or lasers to create visual reference points for the crew, even when the AC-130 already had FLIR and radar. The two-step verification process and the rules of engagement ROE were strictly followed as the final safeguard against friendly fire. The psychological strain inside the cabin was immense. Gunners and sensor operators staring at blurry FLIR screens had to instantly distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians. A single misjudgment could be fatal, and a burden carried for life. The gunner quickly selected the weapon based on target type and distance. That flexibility made the gunship a multi-role attack platform. A critical operational challenge was heat management. The miniguns overheated easily, so the crew strictly followed fire pause cycles to prevent jams or cook-offs caused by residual heat. Low-altitude anti-aircraft fire and the aircraft's acoustic signature posed constant threats. The crack of 12.7mm guns, even when missing, signaled that the enemy was tracking their flight path. The pilot had to keep adjusting speed and bank angle, fighting exhaustion to maintain a precise orbit while avoiding predictable patterns that could invite an ambush. It was a constant trade-off between delivering continuous fire and preserving the crew's lives. Years later, after leaving the service, Ellis recalled, "We never saw anyone just fired at a small point relayed from the ground, and every time I pulled the trigger, I wondered, am I saving them or the opposite?" Firing procedure. 4 steps. 1. Receive order. 2. Verify, eliminate civilians using FLIR, Frost-Prior radar. 3. Classify target. 4. Fire under supervision. The FLIR screen shimmered like a sheet of gray static. Beneath the crosshairs, a faint bright mass heat from a cluster of targets deep in the jungle. Coordinates confirmed, came the FAC's voice over the radio, distorted by static. The auto-stabilization system locked the bank angle. Inside the cabin, everything went silent, only the hum of servo motors adjusting the guns and the steady whir of cooling fans like the breathing of a machine. Warning lights turned red, a sharp metallic click. Then the stream of rounds appeared, a straight pulsing line of light, cold and precise. The sound through the headset was like metal scraping against current. On the FLIR screen, the bright spot flared, then vanished. The display went flat white. Target neutralized, the coordinator's voice, reported as emotionless as a system prompt. Ellis stared at the empty frame. He said quietly, "Only data now. Everything's gone." The aircraft kept circling. A new entry appeared on the mission log. 1. Confirmed hit. Core message. The gunship doctrine is a fusion of power and discipline. Perfection in every technical detail and strict control procedures created an overwhelming advantage, forcing the enemy to rewrite their entire strategy. The appearance of the gunship from the AC-47 Spooky to the AC-130 Spectre forced the PAVN and Viet Cong VC to change their entire tactics. They reduced night attacks, dispersed their formations, and stretched out their supply lines. The darkness that once sheltered them became a hazardous zone. Gunships affected the enemy's morale, strategy, and tempo of operations directly. They marked a turning point in the art of modern warfare. U.S. intelligence recorded from 1966 that night, attacks fell sharply. Convoys on the trail were forced to break up into single vehicles, spaced kilometers apart, and infantry dispersed into small groups to avoid the AC-130's radar and FLIR. The intensity of the fire led them to call the gunship a fire-breathing dragon. The roar of engines, the bright trails of tracer rounds, and the successive explosions produced a powerful psychological effect, forcing troops to spread out and degrading their ability to coordinate. Previously, the PAVN and VC had habitually massed forces to overwhelm, but a single pass by an AC-130 could wipe out an entire company in minutes. From then on, dispersion became mandatory at the cost of speed and striking power. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of supply, became a primary target. A 1971 report recorded that traffic on that route dropped by more than 30% as AC-130 activity increased. Gunships did more than destroy targets. They disrupted the enemy's entire logistical system. After Vietnam, gunships became a lasting doctrinal platform. The AC-130 continued to appear in operations in Grenada, 1983, Panama, 1989, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Modern variants such as the AC-130J Ghost Rider are equipped with precision-guided weapons and advanced sensors. They pave the way for SEAD tactics and serve as principal fire support in special missions, CSR close air support. Gunships stand as proof of the power of innovation and adaptation under pressure. From a simple C-47, transport engineers and strategists created a weapon that changed the battlefield. The lesson extends beyond Vietnam. Victory depends not only on strength, but on adaptability and creative thinking. Years after Vietnam, at a small fire support symposium, a clip of AC-130 support in Iraq was shown. FLIR locked the target. A 105mm round hit a single building precisely, and the forces on the ground withdrew safely. In the rear row, a silver-haired man whose name tag read Mark Ellis Rhett watched the screen for a long time. He did not speak of feats. He simply murmured to the young officer beside him, "Different aircraft, different sensors, but the problem's the same. Keep rounds on the head of whoever is shooting at your men." Another night at an outpost like Delta. The darkness was still thick, but now it was rent by a ring of precise fire from the sky. Classical logic closed the sky. Once a place of impotence had become the solution.